The Positive Theory of Capital by Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk. Book 2. Capital as Instrument of Production. Chapter 4. The Theory of the Formation of Capital. In our science there are three views in circulation as to the formation of capital. One finds its origin in saving, a second in production, and a third in both together. Of these the third enjoys the widest acceptance, and it is also the correct one. But the formula will have to be amplified to some extent, and presented in a way that is at once clearer and more true to life than has usually been the case. To put the matter, first of all, in its simplest conceivable terms, suppose a recluse working absolutely without capital, say some Robinson Crusoe, thrown on a lonely shore without either tools or weapons. Being without capital, he must at first support life in the most primitive fashion, as for instance by gathering berries which grow wild. Now what must happen before he can get possession of his first capital, say a bow and arrow? Let us put the first theory to the test. Is saving by itself sufficient to call capital into existence? Certainly not. With the one possession that he has, his wild fruits, our Crusoe may save and stint as much as he please. He will accumulate a store of berries, goods for consumption, but that will never give him a single bow or arrow. As we can easily see, these must be positively produced. Is it sufficient, then, for the origination of capital that it be produced? Again, certainly not. Of course, once Crusoe has the length of commencing to produce capital, the formation of capital is as good as accomplished. But before he gets that length, there is something else to be done, and that something is by no means self-evident. Productive powers are to be set free for the proposed formation of capital, and this can only be done, as we shall see, through saving. The amount of original productive powers which our Crusoe has daily at his command is equivalent, leaving natural gifts out of account, to one day's labor, which we shall assume to be 10 hours of labor. Suppose now that the berries within reach of his hut are so scarce that a full day's labor of 10 hours is necessary to provide as much food as will just support him in bare life. Obviously no formation of capital is possible. There is no use advising him to produce a bow and arrow. Producing requires strength and time, and all the time and strength our Crusoe has is fully claimed already to keep him in life. To produce capital, then, may be difficult enough without something else, and what that is will appear immediately on our varying a little the assumed facts of the illustration. Suppose there is such wealth of berries that the result of 9 hours gathering is sufficient to support bare life, while 10 hours gathering gives a return such as to guarantee a subsistence amply sufficient to maintain Crusoe in health and strength. Obviously, he has now a choice between two lines of conduct. Either he may take advantage of the opportunity thus offered to complete his provision, and consume each day the fruits of an entire 10 hours' day of labor, in which case it is perfectly clear that he has now no time and strength left to make a bow and arrows, or although the productive power at his disposal would enable him to live better, he may content himself with the barest living, which, as we said, can be provided by the 9 hours' labor of gathering. Then, and only then, has he a 10th hour free to which to make weapons for future use. This amounts to saying, in other words, that before capital can actually be formed, the productive powers necessary to its making must be saved by encroaching on the moment's enjoyment. To anticipate and avoid a mistake very apt to be made, it must be said distinctly that this encroaching on the moment's enjoyment need by no means involve downright privation. With more productive labor, Crusoe's choice would not lie, as in the above illustration, between bare living and comfortable living, but perhaps between comfortable and ample living. It is not a question of the absolute insignificance of these claims on the movement's enjoyment, but on the relation to that amount which I may indicate in the shortest and most generally intelligible way by the word income, an expression, unfortunately, not yet strictly enough defined in scientific usage. The essential thing is that the current endowment of productive powers should not be entirely claimed for the immediate consumption of the current period, but that a portion of this endowment should be retained for the service of a future period. But such a retention will undoubtedly be called a real saving of productive powers. A saving of productive powers, be it noted, for productive powers, and not for the goods which constitute capital, are the immediate objective of saving. This is an important point which must be strongly emphasized because, in the current view, too little consideration is given to it. Man saves consumption goods, his means of enjoyment; he thus saves productive powers, and with these finally he can produce capital. It is only exceptionally that capital itself is the immediate object of savings. It may happen in the case of those goods which by nature admit of being used either for consumption or for production, such as grain. To the extent that a man withdraws such goods from immediate use in consumption, his saving directly lays the foundation of capital. To build on that foundation, of course, the negative element of saving must have added to it the positive element of devoting the saved goods to production as intermediate products. It is easy to show that every further increase of the existing stock of capital is limited by the same conditions as the first formation. Assume that for a month our Crusoe consumes daily only so much fruit as he can gather in 9 hours' labor, and devotes the 10th hour to making weapons. As a result of this 30 hours' work he now owns a bow and arrow, and in them he has the possibility of making his living much more easily and amply than before. Naturally his desires widen. He wishes decent clothes, a house, all sorts of things that minister to comfort. But for these he requires the suitable intermediate products, axes, nails, braces, etc. Now we ask further, what kind of conditions must be fulfilled that Crusoe may obtain this new capital? This is very easily answered if he makes use of the improved circumstances which he owes to the possession of the bow and arrows, simply to increase his immediate consumption; that is, if he spends the whole labor time at his disposal in the service of the moment, hunting, gathering fruits, and sleeping. Not only is it impossible for him to acquire new capital, but he will lose the old. Bows and arrows do not last forever. In a month's time we shall say his arrows will be spent, and his bow will be worn out. If, therefore, his capital is to remain in existence, he must obviously employ at least one of the 10 hours in renewing his weapons, and, at the most, he can employ 9 only in gathering and hunting. To put it in the propositional form, to retain capital in existence, man must make over and devote to the service of the future at least so much of the productive powers of the current period as he has consumed during the current period of the produce of former productive powers. Or, to put it in other words, the consumption of the current period is limited by the produce of as many productive powers, present and past taken together, as come into existence anew during the current period. Finally, if an increase of capital is to become possible, obviously a still greater proportion of the current productive powers must be withdrawn from the consumption of the present and transferred to the service of the future. Of his 10 hours of labor, our Crusoe must devote 1 to renewing his weapons and less than 9 to gathering berries and killing game, if he is to make the new capital he desires in what remains free of his labor time. To put it generally, he must curtail the immediate consumption of the current period to such a point that it uses up the produce of fewer past and present productive powers than come into existence anew in the same period. He must, in a word, save productive powers. All this is quite clear and simple. Indeed, it is even a little too simple for our purpose. Robinson aids and pictures of primitive circumstances are very good when the object is to present clearly the simplest typical principles, to give a kind of skeleton of economical procedure, and to that extent, I trust, our Robinson aid also has done good service. But naturally they cannot give us an adequate picture of those peculiar and developed forms in which this skeleton clothes itself in the living actuality of a modern economic community. And it is just at this point that it becomes important to fill out the abstract formula with explanation to the illustration taken from life. We shall, therefore, leave the lonely shore of our Crusoe and come to the industrial conduct of a great nation with its millions of people.